Okay, so welcome to our lecture talking about what policies are being adopted in response to environmental change. And the slides for this were developed for the 10th edition of the book Human Geography, People, Places, and Culture. So the information is a bit dated, but just a bit. It's still really pretty good. Um, First thing we got to talk about is that one of the major problems or challenges confronting anybody who's trying to solve environmental problems is that most of those problems do not lie within a single jurisdiction. And that word jurisdiction really just kind of means area of control. Okay, so what we've got are problems that cross boundaries. They involve multiple cities or multiple states in the United States or multiple countries. And so that makes it much more difficult to try and solve them. A little bit of historical background. In 1972, the United Nations held a conference on the human environment in Stockholm, Sweden, and it's at that point that we start to see major international governmental organizations starting to play a serious role in environmental policy. And out of that, we see the United Nations develop this conference on the environment and development. We're going to call that the UNCED. Okay, and anytime, by the way, you see anything that starts with UN, you know it's always going to be the United Nations that's involved with it. Okay, so the delegates to the UNCED gave the Global Environmental Authority, we're going to call that the GEF, significant authority over environmental actions on the global scale. And so the UN, by the way, is one of those organizations that works across country boundaries, and it helps guide or meld action that involves multiple governments. Okay, so the GEF, that Global Environmental Facility, funds projects related to 6 major issues. Okay, and a lot of these should sound familiar because you've probably come across them in your biology class or in some of your other science classes. Okay, so the first one is the loss of biodiversity, followed by climate change, the protection of international waters, depletion of the ozone layer, land degradation, and then persistent organic pollutants. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about each one of those as we go. Individual states, though, and states in this sense, we're going to use it in its classical political science sense, meaning countries. So individual countries continue to influence decision making in a whole variety of ways, especially for what's going on within their own boundaries and borders. Okay, so when we talk about biological diversity, first thing you got to know is that biodiversity, literally what we're talking about, is just the sheer number of plants and animals that exist on the planet. Okay, so the Biodiversity Convention calls for establishing areas that are protected and so that are not going to be developed and are going to be left to their natural ways. And then also for a coordinated set of national and international regulations on activities that have significant impacts on biodiversity. So these are things like, for instance, gorilla habitats, if you've learned anything about that, right? Or poaching, which is to say hunting animals without permission. Okay, and those are the types of activities that might have negative impacts that they're working and continuing to work to develop international regulations and to enforce those regulations that they have developed. Okay, they also provide funding for developing countries, and remember, anytime you see that word developing, what you really want to think is those poorer countries, okay? Those poor mid-level countries that maybe don't have as much money to do some of this kind of stuff that's nice but not necessary in terms of helping their people. So they provide funding to help those countries that are trying to meet the terms of the convention. But again, as with so many problems when we're talking about different levels and different types of government, this has proved very, very difficult to implement on anything resembling a systematic scale. All right, and if you remember the controversy a while back about the guy who went and hunted the dentist who went and hunted the lion, and it turned out was killing off a major, ended up killing a major symbol of, I think it was Zimbabwe. But at any rate, that's the kind of activity that has made it so difficult, because what you had was he had hunting guides that he was trusting to be within the convention, and they had wholly different ideas about making money and what that was going to mean for them. Okay, so when we talk about protection of the ozone layer, and this was a big deal when I was a kid, right? So the ozone layer is really, really important because what ozone is it's O3, so it's a type of oxygen, but it's a type of oxygen that helps protect the Earth's surface from very harmful ultraviolet rays from the sun. Pardon me. And studies reveal that most of the main culprits in ozone depletion, and when you hear that word depletion, I want you to think going away or rotting kind of thing, where it's the volume of it's going down, are mostly a group of human-made gases known collectively as, if we shorthanded it, CFCs. If you're a scientist and you like the full technical term, it's chlorofluorocarbons. Okay, and these are often, when I was a kid, the big thing was hairspray that, you press the button and it would project out. And it wasn't like the little push button and it only gives you a little bit, but you press it down and it just go continuously. And so to do this, what they implemented was the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer, and followed by the Montreal Protocol in 1987. And the whole goal of this was to phase out the production and consumption of CFCs. And I really do remember this being a huge conversation around this time, and kind of trying, not to use products that had those because they were depleting the ozone layer. And mind you, in 1987, I was a kid of about 10. Okay, so then we talk about global climate change, and this has been in the news a lot lately, and I know we've done some work around it in class. We see a bunch of different things that have happened, right? So the Earth Summit is kind of the original one, and the whole goal of that was to call on developed countries, read rich, to take measures to reduce their emissions back down to levels that they were in 1990 by the year 2000. And we've been varying degrees of successful with this, just depending on what country we're talking about and which type of emission we're talking about. That was followed by the Kyoto Agreement, which was ambitious and never fully implemented. And different countries have implemented it at different levels. But the goal of the Kyoto Agreement was to set a target period for some of those major countries like the United States, the European Union, Japan, to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. And it actually ended up failing in part because the United States never ratified the agreement, so we never approved it or agreed to be bound by it. Neither the United States nor China, who were two of the world's largest emitters of carbon dioxide, signed the Kyoto Protocol, which again basically undercut it and made it not very successful. And so that's part of the discussions around the recent conversations that are going on now in Paris are going to be how do we get something that we can actually get people to agree to, and part of the problem with Kyoto was that it was supposed to be binding, and so some of the discussion now with Paris is that they're going to set non-binding targets. And what is that going to mean? Okay, so talk a little bit more about global climate change, and we start to look at the fact that the United States has been and continues to be the largest producer of carbon dioxide emissions per person. That's an important note in the world. Okay, so per person, the other way we've heard that in our class is per capita. Okay, in 2009, countries met in Copenhagen, and Copenhagen's in Denmark, by the way, and put together the Copenhagen Agreement, which endorsed the continuation of the Kyoto Accord. But what it did basically was said that countries agreeing to the accord will work to keep global temperature increases to less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And pre-industrial, what we're really talking about are those levels in about roughly 1800-ish. Okay, so these are comparatively very, very low levels, especially for what we're used to today. Some of the other topics that they had agreed to we talk about soil degradation. That just means soils becoming so bad that they can't be planted in, or that they're not habitable for plant life or for animals. They talk about organic pollution in waters, and this is things like, for instance, nitrogen flowing from farms into local watersheds, and that then flowing down the rivers and through the water system and ending up in the ocean. And for instance, we have a huge algal bloom that's in the Gulf, I think it's the Gulf of Mexico, from things that are flushing out, from all these nitrogens that are flushing out through the Mississippi River system. Okay, there might be one more. Let me flip back on my slides here and just check. Uh, no, it looks like um, organic pollutants was the last of it. So that is our discussion of kind of what's going on with some of the current policies and procedures. Um, the US is, of course, working to cut our levels in various ways, again, varying degrees of success. If you're curious about more of kind of what's going on internationally, I would refer you back to that special report out of this week's Economist that we were reading in class. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to bring them to me, and I will see you the next time we meet in class.